September 15, 1940. 10,000 feet above the grey ribbon of the English Channel, sunlight broke through a seam in the clouds, and the polished nose of a supermarine Spitfire flashed like a blade. The smell of aviation fuel and hot oil filled the cockpit. The Merlin engine behind the pilot coughed, then settled into a high, steady note that vibrated through the fuselage. Squadron Leader James "Jimmy" Wilkes eased the throttle and felt the airplane respond not with the familiar, muscular shove he expected, but with a new, keener urgency, as if the whole machine had tightened itself into a spring. Below him, the patchwork of Kent fields moved in muted greens and browns. Ahead, the thin silhouettes of enemy aircraft junkers Ju-88, scouting for convoys, clustered against the sky. The radio crackled with clipped instructions from Biggin Hill. Jimmy fingered the control column and thought of the man who had touched the heart of this plane only hours earlier. A Rolls-Royce mechanic who wouldn't call himself a hero and who had no idea his hands had nudged history. Down at the shadowed hangars, under the oily light and the constant clank of tools, Arthur Mason crouched over a Merlin engine like a surgeon over a patient. He was 40, lean, with grease ingrained under his nails and a voice roughened by long hours in the engine room. Arthur's job was minute work checking tolerances, swapping carburetor jets, making the supercharger happy so the Merlin would pull its weight at altitude. That morning he'd been rushed. A Spitfire had returned from a dawn patrol with a complaint about coughing above 0 feet. The service roster had been stretched thin for weeks. Arthur had 1 hour to find the problem and send that Spitfire back where it belonged. He worked by feel and small instruments, a micrometer, a set of hardened steel gauges, a cigarette stub tucked in his mouth though he never lit it, a calendar pinned to the wall with the dates of raids and losses. When he opened the access panel and peered into the throat of the supercharger, he noticed a tiny burr, a sliver of metal barely wider than a man's fingernail lodged against a vein. His first move was instinctive. He reached for a file and, perhaps too quickly, rasped it away, smoothing the edge, polishing the passage without thinking of the minute change in airflow it would create. Mechanics learned to obey manuals like scripture, but war taught rules of thumb. In the heat of the moment, Arthur altered one small contour on the supercharger's intake, a cosmetic, practical tweak, meant only to clear a restriction. He reassembled, shrugged at the supervisor, and pushed the repair card through. No one raised an eyebrow. Engines failed and engines were fixed. It was the rhythm of the day. At 09:15, Flight Lieutenant Derek Shaw taxied the patched Spitfire out, its engine coughing awake like an animal rising. There was a light, concentrated smell of petrol and burning compression rings. The stick vibrated under his palms, and when he opened the throttle, the Merlin answered with a voice that seemed to search for altitude. Derek climbed first to 3,000, then to 6, then to 10. He felt the boost screw in the supercharger, the press of air into the engine, become firmer. The climb rate improved in precise, startling increments. By 12,000 feet, his altimeter had a steady, confident tick. By 15,000, he was pulling through clouds, and the nose of the plane seemed to point higher, as if a phantom hand lifted it. Back on the ground, the technicians at Biggin Hill glanced at one another when Derek rolled in early. More punch up top. He reported, swearing at the way his words kept failing to capture the sensation. He described a plane that shrugged off the usual loss of oomph and kept pulling, like a climber finding an extra seam of rock when all seemed to be slipping. Derek could not know that in the dim belly of the hangar, Arthur Mason had already run his hands over the engine again, wondering whether the intake he'd smoothed had been the cause. He jotted notes and, after a moment, crossed out a line and wrote, "Check supercharger contour altered." The first real test arrived as the afternoon sun sharpened. Air raid warnings screamed. A formation of Luftwaffe bombers was threading a path toward southeast England. Squadrons scrambled, and the air filled with the thunder of Merlin engines. Jimmy Wilkes led his flight skyward, the radio needle jumping with terse commands, and the faint, clinical voice of ground control cutting through the roar. At altitude, they met Messerschmitt Bf-1, 109 sleek, dangerous predators eager to pick off the defenders' tails. What happened next was a small, explosive piece of theater. In the melee, A Spitfire under Jimmy's wing peeled off and went vertical, climbing like a dog with its head up. Enemy fighters tried to follow, throttles cranked, their faces intent and masked with oxygen. The 109s had always enjoyed an advantage in climb at certain altitudes. Doctrine and pride told them so. But now, as the British fighters swooped and climbed, the Luftwaffe pilots found themselves left with empty air where they expected the defenders. A 109 rose and rose until its engine coughed and spluttered, unable to match the sudden, unanticipated climb of the Spitfires. Inside one German cockpit, Oberleutnant Franz Keller cursed when his altitude bled away and his guns found nothing. He radioed back to formation and the reports were the same. The RAF were climbing out of reach, not dogfighting where the Germans wanted them to. They had lost the meeting ground. On the ground at Biggin Hill, a small knot of engineers watched torn radio transcripts and exchanged looks that mixed triumph with disbelief. Arthur Mason stood with his hands empty, hearing the radio account and feeling an invalid mix of pride and terror. He had not meant to append the physics of his engine. He had only smoothed a burr, yet there it was, a chain reaction. A spit in the intake, a micro change in airflow, a modest increase in boost at altitude, and a Spitfire that could take the sky on different terms. Jimmy's Spitfire, nose tipped into sun, and a tracer path behind it, became a small instrument of a larger shift. Pilots would later compare notes in mess halls and over beer. Some swore the Merlin had a new heart that week. Others spoke of mechanics' luck. But for now, in the living thunder of combat, one plane climbed and one pilot, gripping his stick, found the sky suddenly fuller of possibility. The war in the air had always been measured in margins. Today a margin had been won by a file, a hand, and a moment's inattentive bravery. Down on the ground, hundreds of miles from the front lines, the battle for Britain's survival was being fought not in the sky, but in the quiet hum of a Rolls-Royce factory in Derby, England. It was 1940. The air smelled of oil and molten metal. Rows of engines, Merlin engines, sat like slumbering beasts waiting to roar. In one corner, a young mechanic named Albert Henshaw bent over a supercharger assembly, his hands blackened with grease. The supercharger, a complex mechanical compressor, was the heart of the Merlin's power. It pushed more air into the engine's cylinders, allowing for greater combustion and thrust. But that afternoon, under flickering factory lights, Henshaw made a subtle change. He adjusted the angle of the impeller blades inside the supercharger, not by design, but by accident. The blueprint had been smudged. The numbers looked like 15 when they should have been 10. When the engine was mounted and tested, something unexpected happened. The machine didn't just hum, it screamed. The boost pressure spiked beyond expectations. Engineers rushed over, certain the readings were wrong. Yet the data held steady. The error had made the Merlin breathe harder, push stronger. Henshaw, expecting a reprimand, braced for trouble. But instead, Chief Engineer Stanley Hooker called it the most beautiful mistake I've ever seen. Hooker, a mathematical genius working secretly to enhance the Merlin's performance, realized immediately what the accident meant. The Spitfire could now climb faster, fight longer, and reach higher altitudes than any German Messerschmitt in the sky. Hooker refined Henshaw's blunder into a deliberate modification, reshaping the supercharger's impeller and adjusting its gearing ratio. Within weeks, the first test Spitfire, equipped with the new engine, took flight. When the pilot landed, his face was pale with disbelief. "It climbs like the devil himself is chasing it," he said. The British Air Ministry approved the change almost immediately. The mistake became standard. Every Spitfire that rolled out afterward carried the improved Merlin, thanks to a mechanic's moment of imperfection. But as the skies above England darkened with the thunder of the Luftwaffe's advance, that single modification was about to be tested in the most brutal air campaign the world had ever seen. July 10, 1940. The southern coast of England, from the cliffs of Dover to the fields of Kent, the air trembled with the sound of engines. Hundreds of German bombers crossed the channel under escort by sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s. their silver wings glinting in the morning sun. On the British side, radar towers, those tall, skeletal sentinels, picked up the echoes of the approaching storm. Within minutes, the scramble sirens wailed across RAF bases. Scramble, scramble. In a flurry of boots and roaring engines, Squadron Leader Alan Deere climbed into his Supermarine Spitfire MKI, powered by the newly enhanced Rolls-Royce Merlin Roman III. The canopy clamped shut with a metallic click. The airfield vanished below as Deere pulled back on the stick. The Spitfire surged upward with ferocious energy, like a hawk unleashed. He'd flown older models before, but this felt different. The throttle responded instantly. The climb rate was unreal. Within seconds, he broke through the cloud cover, heart pounding, sweat freezing against his temples. Blue Leader, this is control. Bandits, heading 0-9-0, Angels 15. Copy that, Deere replied, leveling out. Then he saw them, a swarm of Messerschmitts above the bombers, black dots slicing across the white clouds. The radio crackled with orders and panic. The Luftwaffe outnumbered them nearly 2-1, but the Spitfires had something new, the mistake that turned into magic. Deere dove into the fight, cannon fire slicing through the air. A Messerschmitt latched onto his tail, but the Spitfire's supercharged engine gave him what no German could match, instant vertical escape. He yanked the stick and shot upward, the Merlin screaming with power, leaving the enemy fighters struggling to follow. He rolled over the top, dove back down and opened fire. One burst, one hit. The German aircraft spiraled into the sea below. Across southern England, similar duels played out. British pilots, once struggling to keep pace with the Luftwaffe, now found themselves in command of the skies. The new supercharged Spitfires could climb 20% faster, recover quicker, and hold altitude even when the air thinned. Inside underground war rooms, RAF strategists noticed something extraordinary. Kill ratios were improving, and German raids were being blunted. The miracle engine was turning the tide. The Luftwaffe's confidence began to waver. Reports from downed German pilots spoke of impossible climbs and ghost planes that vanished into the clouds. No one outside Rolls-Royce knew the truth, that a misread number in a Derby factory had quietly rewritten the fate of Europe's skies. But the war was far from over, and the Merlin's evolution was only just beginning. 1941, the roar of the Merlin was now legend. From the rolling fields of Kent to the factories of Manchester, its sound had become the heartbeat of Britain's resistance. But at Rolls-Royce, engineers were not satisfied. They knew the Germans were developing faster, deadlier aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190 had arrived, beast that outclimbed and outgunned the early Spitfires. The RAF needed more power, more altitude, more speed. Inside a dimly lit test hangar, Stanley Hooker stood beside a new engine model, the Merlin 45. It looked similar to its predecessors, but beneath the cowling, it was a different creature. The once accidental supercharger design had now been perfected and doubled. Hooker had added a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, an engineering marvel that allowed the engine to breathe effortlessly, even at 30,000 feet. Hooker watched as the test Spitfire's propeller spun into a silver blur. The ground shook. The air filled with a thunderous growl that rattled the windows. The test pilot, Geoffrey Quill, pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft leapt off the runway like it had been struck by lightning. Over the radio, Quill's voice crackled, barely containing excitement. "She climbs like a homesick angel." In that moment, the Spitfire transformed from an agile defender into a dominant predator. The improved Merlin could sustain power far higher than before. Where German engines choked, the British ones thrived. By 1942, this engine wasn't just defending Britain anymore. It was carrying the fight to Europe. The same mistaken principle that powered the Spitfire now lived in Hurricane bombers, Mosquito fighters, and even American P-51 Mustangs. When American engineers at North American Aviation received the license to install the Merlin in their Mustangs, the result was historic. The P-51D Mustang, powered by a British-designed Merlin engine, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no Allied fighter had managed before. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now thundered with the sound of British and American aircraft, each one carrying within it a spark born from Albert Henshaw's unintentional modification. What had begun as a factory floor error had evolved into an engine that changed the balance of air power across the entire war. And yet, few ever knew the full story. Henshaw returned to his modest home in Derby, never realizing the ripple effect of his mistake. He never received medals or headlines, only a quiet sense of pride that his hands had helped build something unstoppable. But the pilots knew. Every time they opened the throttle, every time they felt the aircraft surge beneath them like a living thing, they knew the Merlin wasn't just an engine. It was the soul of the Spitfire. As the war pressed on toward victory, one truth echoed across the skies. Britain didn't just fight with courage, it fought with genius, born from a mechanic's imperfection and an engineer's vision. The sound of that genius still lingers today, in museums and memorial airfields, where the Merlin's growl can still be heard on summer afternoons.